In this video, we're going to go through an AWS provided CloudFormation template piece by piece and see how it all fits together. What you should get from this video is a sense of the best practices that AWS recommends for CloudFormation when building your templates. And of course, right off the bat, we have the AWS template format version and the description, which we don't need to spend too much time on, but then we have parameters. And you notice right off the bat, we have VPC ID, and what it's looking for specifically is the ID of a virtual private cloud. Now, when you see a parameter like this that's pulling a specific kind of AWS service, what we're going to get is a drop-down of qualifying services. So in this case, we'll get a drop-down of virtual private cloud IDs. Now, of course, you'll notice we have the description and then the constraint description, which means if they don't select one of these IDs, then they'll get this error here. And next, similarly to how we got a list of virtual private cloud IDs, here we're going to get a list of subnet IDs. And then of course, a similar constraint description telling us that we need to choose at least 2 subnets for this virtual private cloud. It also looks like this template is going to spin up at least one EC2 instance because it's asking us for an EC2 key pair. And you'll notice once again, the type is specifically key pair key name, which means it's going to give us a list of valid key pairs for whatever region we try to deploy this into. Next we have instance type, and it looks like it's going to be a list of allowed values that we can provide for EC2 instance types. And then with the constraint description that it must be a valid EC2 type. With SSH location, you're going to notice a few new types of parameter descriptions, and that's min length, max length, and allowed pattern. So in this case, we're giving it a type of string, but we're also saying that the minimum length of the string has to be at least 9 characters. And similarly, the maximum length of the string has to be 18 characters. We're given a default CIDR range, and then the allowed pattern, you'll notice, is a regex description that makes us match the pattern of a CIDR block. Next we have DB class, and it looks like it can be just any string with a default of db.t2.small, and then similarly to our list of EC2 instances, we're giving some default allowed values that we can choose from, which once again means that when we try to spin this stack up using this template, we're going to get these instances in a dropdown. You'll notice here that it's asking for a WordPress database name with a type of string, and then once again it has to be at least 1 character long with a maximum length of 64, and a different regex pattern. Looks like this database name has to be alphanumeric. Similarly to the database name, looks like we also have a database user with its own minimum and maximum length, and it looks like it also needs to be alphanumeric for the allowed pattern. And then finally, for the same kind of pattern, we have database password, which has to be at least 8 characters, at most 41 characters, and once again, alphanumeric. Here's a new one. So for multi-AZ database, the type is once again string, but it looks like we're forcing this parameter to be a Boolean because we're giving it allowed values of only true and false. We're going to see this one pop up later in the template. Next we have web server capacity. Looks like this one's going to be a number, and we have to choose a specific range, at least 1 and at most 5. Next we have database allocated storage. Once again, nothing surprising here, just a number with a minimum value of 5 and a maximum value of 1024. And next, you've seen mappings already, but just to go through this one more time, looks like our first object in mappings is AWS instance type 2 arch, and then we can map that to several different types of EC2 instances. Next, it looks like we have AWS instance type 2 nat arch, and then similarly a list of EC2 values. And we'll see this pop up again later in the template. And finally, and this is something you'll see in a lot of different templates, AWS region arch2 AMI. And what this is going to do is allow us to provide a region and then map that specifically to a particular AMI. And when I say that we're going to provide a region, I don't mean that we're going to have to set a region as a parameter. CloudFormation is smart enough to find its region for you, and you'll see that later in this template. And now we're in the resources block, which once again is the only required block in a CloudFormation template. And the first resource It's called Application Load Balancer, and that looks like that's exactly what it is because it has the type of AWS Elastic Load Balancing version 2 Load Balancer. And for this CloudFormation resource type, you only need one property, and that's the subnets. And it looks like we're giving it a reference to the subnets parameter. If you'll recall, the subnets parameter, we're going to have to choose at least 2 subnets, and those subnets are going to be provided to us in the form of a list. Next, we have a load balancing listener, and this one has a few different properties. Now, this listener is going to do a few different things. It's going to attach itself to an application load balancer, and it's also going to set where it needs to forward its traffic. So for default actions, it looks like we have a type of forward and a target group ARN, which means we're going to forward traffic to a target group with a matching Amazon resource name of ALB target group. Now this one doesn't look familiar, and that's because this time it's not referring to a parameter with the name of ALB target group. As you'll see in just a moment, it's actually referring to another resource. And this is something you'll see very commonly. Exactly what you get when you refer to a resource depends on the resource, but very commonly it's going to be the ID or the Amazon resource number. The Amazon resource name. And then finally for the listener, it looks like it's going to be port 80 with a protocol of HTTP. And then similarly to how we're referring to a resource with the name of ALB target group, it looks like because this wasn't a parameter, we're going to see this as a resource later on. And to summarize what's happening here, it looks like in this template we're creating at least an application load balancer with an application load balancer target group, and then a forwarder that's going to forward traffic between the two. I don't know about you, but that beats the heck out of going through the AWS Management Console and doing all of this manually. Looks like what we have next is a security group, the type of AWS EC2 security group. And of course, a security group is something that controls access to and from instances at the EC2 instance level. So what we probably expect for the security group is either ingress or egress rules. And that's exactly what we see here. We have a group description talking about what the EC2 security group is going to do for us. And then it looks like we have a few ingress rules, including the protocol, the from port, the to port, and so on. And then finally, it looks like it's referring to a VPC ID. Now recall that VPC ID is one of the parameters that we chose, which means we're going to be deploying this into an existing VPC. Next we have an autoscaling group. So it looks like this autoscaling group is going to be deployed into whatever subnets we designate. It's also going to have a launch configuration name matching our reference to launch config. And recall that launch config was not one of the parameters we set, which means we're referring to a launch configuration that we're going to create later in this template. And before we move any further here, let's just take one quick second very quickly to review the relationship between autoscaling groups and launch configurations one more time just so there's no confusion. An autoscaling group, of course, is a policy that's going to allow you to scale in and out for EC2 instances based on a specific launch configuration. And what that means is you're going to create and destroy EC2 instances, but the ones you create are going to be created using this launch configuration, which controls, among other things, the EC2 instance type and the Amazon machine image. And it looks like it refers to the parameter of web server capacity and the target group of the target group that we created earlier. And finally, we have an autoscaling group creation policy, and it looks like we're only giving it one parameter, and that's the resource signal with a timeout of 15 minutes. And finally, we're giving it an update policy with an autoscaling rolling update with one minimum instance, the max batch size of 1, and then a 15-minute pause time as well. Now recall that in our autoscaling group, we referred to a launch configuration that we were going to have to create later in the template. And that looks like that's what's up next. We have the name of launch config with the type of AWS autoscaling launch configuration. Now, we won't go very into detail about metadata for launch configuration, but very quickly, what this means is metadata is something you can apply to an EC2 resource when you're spinning it up in CloudFormation. And it allows you to control all sorts of things about the instance itself including any operations on files you want to run, any packages you'd like to install, any files you'd like to move around, and commands you'd like to run. Now once again, we're not going to spend too much time on the metadata section of this template, but what it looks like it's doing is installing WordPress and then getting the server ready to serve WordPress. Next, for the launch configuration, we have our properties. And for properties, most of these, of course, are going to be the properties of the EC2 instances that would be spun up using this launch configuration. Of course, the first is the image ID, and it looks like it's referring to the mapping section and specifically the section containing those Amazon machine images. Instance type is a reference to, of course, the instance type that we chose a parameter. Security groups are, of course, referring to the web server security groups that we also set earlier. And then key name is a reference to one of our final parameters, which was, of course, the EC2 key pair name that we chose in the parameters earlier. User data is something that gets spun up after the server has been instantiated. And it looks like what we're passing for the user data here is a bash script. Now, exactly what the bash script is doing is less important here than noticing we're referring to the AWS region. And like I mentioned earlier in this video, instead of having to manually pass a region to a CloudFormation template, CloudFormation is smarter than that. If we give it the AWS region type, then it's going to automatically determine which region it's being deployed in and place that string wherever we tell it to. And then finally, we have a database EC2 security group and a database instance. Of course, the security group is going to set rules that are similar to the EC2 security group we configured earlier, including the IP protocol, the from port, and the to port. And then finally, for the database instance, this resource is an RDS database instance, and it's going to use the remainder of the parameters that we set at the beginning of this video, including whether we want a multi-AZ database, and if you recall, we gave this two possible strings, true and false. So right here is going to translate to true or false. And then finally, we have our database user, password, class, and allocated storage. And then finally, we're giving it one output, and it looks like we're using an intrinsic function called join. The intrinsic join function takes two arguments. The first is the string you'd like to join your segments on, and the second is a list of segments. Now it looks like because this string is empty, we don't want to join it on any particular character. We just want to join the segments in the segment list. And then second, based on the first segment here, it looks like we're building out a URL. And that's what's happening. We have a protocol, and then it looks like we're getting the attribute of an application load balancer. Specifically, we're grabbing the DNS name, which means it's going to be HTTP, and then the DNS name of the load balancer, and then finally, the directory containing our WordPress website. And now that we've been over every resource and option in this template, let's see what it looks like when we try to deploy it. So I'm going to deploy a new stack as usual, and because this is an AWS S3 provided URL, I'm going to stick that in there and click Next. We'll give it a name, and then you'll notice all of the parameters that we talked about previously in the template. There's that list of key names that we talked about. And then remember the true false values that we had. Next, of course, we expected a list of all of the subnets that we can choose from. And notice it's not choosing all subnets in a particular VPC because that's not what CloudFormation does when you call that resource. We're calling any subnet, which means any subnet in this region is going to show up in this list. And finally, we have a list of all VPCs in this region and the initial number of web servers we want for our auto-scaling group. And this is going to take just a little bit of time, so I'm going to pause this video while we deploy, and we'll be right back. And we're back, and it looks like our stack finished deploying. And recall, it deployed all the resources that we'd need to serve WordPress behind a load balancer. So let's check out what some of that looks like in the EC2 dashboard. And as always, we'll get there by clicking Services and EC2, and I'll open that in a new tab so that I can keep this here for reference. First of all, it looks like we have a load balancer with a target group and a listener that points to the target group. So let's see what that looks like. So in EC2, on the left side of the page, of course, we're looking for load balancers under load balancing. And there it is with the WordPress prefix. So we have the load balancer created. Looks like we have the listener, and it forwards to the right target group. And of course, if we click on this target group, we expect to see our registered instance. So let's check out targets. And there it is. We have our one registered healthy instance. Looks like the instance is healthy, which means it spun up with no issues. And let's go to that instance and make sure that the security group we chose also got attached. And there it is. There's the security group with the rules that it should have. Alright, that'll do it for our video on an AWS provided CloudFormation template and every resource in that template. So if all of that made sense, then feel free to move on.